If you aren't familiar with Elliot Page by name, you may know him as the trans man who began his acting career as Ellen Page. So should Elliot Page stick to movies, or is his memoir worth your time? Hi, I'm Amanda, and this is Spineless Books, your one-stop shop for all things audiobook. Now, before I begin this review in particular, I want to make a really clear statement. Please know that in this book, there are some very sensitive topics. We are talking about a memoir written by a person who has transitioned genders in the public eye. And I want it to be really clear to all of my viewers that any criticisms I have of this book are not criticisms of people who are trans. I have zero issue, and I want people to clearly know that I'm not in any way trying to undermine or misrepresent or just criticize people who have transitioned genders or are thinking about it or want to or would if they could. This is absolutely something I respect. And in reading this memoir, while I do have some criticisms, please know they are not about trans identity. I am fully wanting to make that clear as you watch. So with that said, I'd like to tell you a little bit about why I chose to read this book, because for a long time this book was on my radar, but not really something I was gravitating towards. I didn't really find myself interested in it. I do read memoirs fairly often, but this just wasn't one that I was like, ooh, I want to know more about Elliot Page. So what changed my mind? Really, very simply, as many of you know, I'm a teacher, and we do bias and diversity, equity, and inclusion training at my school. And this year I got the opportunity to participate in a small group training with the goal of then taking the training that we had and translating it out to the larger community. And it was a really cool experience. I was very honored to get to do it. And when it came time to translating that information out to the community, I was kind of surprised, honestly, to see that it was fully up to me what I was going to do. So not having an idea, I grabbed a partner who I work with and I just said, hey, let's be friends and figure this presentation out together. We both teach in the arts, and naturally that led to looking at bias in the arts and examining all of the different ways that this very progressive industry actually is really not that progressive. So my partner's part of this presentation was that he looked at bias in the music industry and a whole bunch of facts ranging from, things in classical music to the hip hop world to how our music software algorithms work. And he essentially presented all of the ways that bias exists in the art world. Then my job was to look for examples of things that can open our perspective. So how is it that I can use the arts to my advantage to learn about other people's experience? And here's basically what I came to as a conclusion. I'm never going to walk up to somebody on the street and say, hey, what's it like to live in your skin? Or what's it like to have your sexual identity? Or what's it like to have your gender identity? You didn't like your body? Tell me more. That's not something that I'm going to do. It's not comfortable, it's rude, and it's disrespectful. Plus, even if I did have somebody who agreed to have that conversation with me, I'm not going to get a thought out, edited, crafted version of their answers. I'm just going to get what they think of in that moment. So the arts really allow us to take those self-expressions that people are crafting and are agreeing to safely put out into the world and to take those in. And we can learn from those expressions. So self-expression's been around for 40,000 years. It's not new. It goes back to cave paintings. It's all over the place. But as I was looking for examples, I immediately thought, this might be the time that Elliot Page memoir, Pageboy, comes into play. And sure enough, I read it in preparation for this presentation. So my thoughts today, again, please be clear, are really about the book as a book, not about trans identity. Now, I'm going to be honest right off the bat. I didn't love this memoir. It was confusing. There was a lot of jumps in time. There were a lot of characters to follow. Sometimes you would have an anecdote about childhood in a current time story. Other times you would have an anecdote about a current time story in a childhood story. It was really confusing to follow. There was a lot of very explicit sexual detail. Now, I understand the relevance of that in Elliot Page telling his story. He talked a lot about the things that he went through that made him sort of disown his body and feel uncomfortable. But I really kind of found the structure of this book hard. I had a hard time following. I had a hard time knowing what I was listening to as I was listening. It was almost as if I drifted out for just a second, I totally got confused. So I think as a memoir, it really wasn't structured well. And I get it. I get that, Elliot Page has every right to write his memoir the way that he wants. It's his memoir, not mine. But I don't know. I just found it kind of all over the place. And maybe that actually is an ideal representation of his experience. But for me as a reader, I found it really hard. There were a lot of stories in this book that were deeply introspective. In my opinion, the stories that were the most introspective were very universal to the human experience. They were the kinds of things that we all feel and we all go through about figuring ourselves out, our relationships with our parents, our romantic relationships. But I found that many of the passages that were about being trans and sexual identity were a little bit less introspective. And those are the areas where I kind of felt like, okay, I don't really know as much about this, so this is what I feel like I can learn from this memoir, yet it didn't really go there in a lot of places. There were a few passages that did, but not most. Now, I do think it's affirming to have passages that are universal, because when we talk about hate towards trans people and we think about the idea that there are people that feel like these are people who are so different from them and they can't identify with them and they can't relate in any way to their experience, having passages from Elliot Page that say, hey, look, I'm a person just like you, is really helpful. I think, unfortunately, the likelihood of people that need to hear that information reading this book is not that high, which is kind of sad. It was kind of funny because a lot of what Elliot Page described when he was a child, of wanting to have a boy's name and play boy games and, hang out with all the boys, I related to a ton. I was a total tomboy growing up. I always wanted to be Luke Skywalker when my friends and I were playing Star Wars with our wiffle bats. I had 2 older brothers. I wanted to do everything they did. Now, my identity has never really been super feminine. I am a cisgendered straight woman, but I related a lot to what Elliot Page was saying, but where the line was drawn is that I've never disliked my body. And I can't imagine going through all of those things and also having a self-loathing, as Elliot Page puts it, because I just think that would be so challenging. It was already challenging wanting to have, my play be different than what I was seeing. But Elliot Page really, that part hit me really hard because I understood a level of that. And then it went to an entire level beyond that I couldn't relate to. So I appreciated learning that very much. As a narrator, Elliot Page was surprisingly flat. I found him to be incredibly monotone. It was a very serious narration. Now, obviously that makes sense given the nature of the memoir, but I was kind of surprised that this is a person who is an actor and knows how to use vocal inflection and cadence and tone in order to tell a story, because it really kind of felt like he was muttering a story for most of the book. I was very, very much not in favor of his narration, but I feel like when it's a memoir, you should be the one reading it. So I appreciated that he chose to read his own memoir, but I didn't really love the way he did. I think it's okay to be talking about a serious subject and still keep your narration up and interesting. And while it might be argued that this was serious and therefore it had to be a serious narration, I'm not sure I agree with that. I'm not suggesting Elliot Page should have narrated this book in a silly way, but I think it could have been a little bit more energetic and still been serious. Now, before you come at me about the fact that I really didn't love this memoir, I am still glad I read it. I will say that openly, that I am absolutely glad that I took the time to hear his experience. I think it's really important to hear the experience of others. And while it may not be my favorite memoir, now it's in my bank. And I think that's really important. I do feel like while I'm not sure that this book had the introspection I was hoping for, I do have an understanding, more than I had before, of why there's so much self-harm in the trans community. It makes sense when you read this. And I think that's something that he explained well, though simply. But I really am impressed that he shared that part of his journey, because it opened my eyes quite a bit. Did I love this book? No. But I'm glad Elliot Page told his story, and I'm glad I got to hear his perspective. It's one perspective. It's not all perspectives. So it's really important to keep that in mind. But even though I didn't love the book, it was valuable. So remember, you might love what I hate and hate what I love, so make your own opinion. But thanks for listening to mine. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.